schooling her 2 kids, editing, designing book covers, and pretending her house will clean itself. I like that too.
Rich
Roseanna
imagination.
is, I know, mine needs to be cleaned right now. Roseanna is the author of a slew of historical novels that span several continents and thousands of years. Spies and war and mayhem always seem to find their way into her books to offset her real life, which is blessedly ordinary. You can learn more about her and her stories at rosannamwhite.com. So I read one of Roseanna's books last year, for the first book I've ever read by you, A Name Unknown, I think it was called. Absolutely loved it. So welcome, Roseanna, and I'm just turn it over to you and let you get started.
All right. Thank you so much. So I love interactions. So I will pause a couple times to take questions as they may come up. And then at the end, this will not be a huge long class, so we'll have plenty of time for questions, because that's one of my favorite things about conference, be it in person or virtual, is the chance to interact with you guys. So I will talk, but then I really want to be able to just talk with you and to you. So please feel free.
I should have said that. Drop your questions in the chat as she's talking, as she's going along, and I'm going to monitor that so she doesn't have to, and I'll give her your questions.
Yep. And then when I'm done, feel free to unmute and ask your questions out loud. Okay. So let me pull up my notes for reference here. There we go. Okay. So if you are anything like me, you have so many ideas. I have so many ideas that there is no way I'm ever going to be able to write them all in my lifetime. And yet I keep coming up with new ideas. Or maybe you're the opposite and you have to work really hard and dig down really deep and do a lot of research to kind of fine tune and hone and tease out those ideas. Either way, you are going to quickly learn that the idea for a book or a project or whatever it is you're writing is not the same as the finished product, right? It is just step one. And the analogy I'm going to use through this whole class is that it is just the seed. So after you get the inspiration for a book, I'm going to call it a book. Maybe you're working on a screenplay. Maybe you're working on a series of articles, whatever it is, your work. I will probably just call it book as a kind of shorthand throughout here. Whatever it is you're working on, it's going to require a lot of hard work. Just like with a plant, you have to take the seed and plant it, water it, tend it, harvest it, so much more. So I have been working in the Christian publishing industry for a long time, going on 20 years now, and I have met so many writers who claim some variation of God gave me this story or God gave me this book idea. And that's wonderful, right? Hopefully we are all feeling inspired by the Lord to write the things that we write. And I've heard them say that it was like God gave them a direct download, that he just put this idea full formed into their minds. And that is awesome too. I've had that experience a couple of times. Sometimes I have to really tease an idea out. Like I have that, seed of inspiration, but I have to work to make it fully formed. Other times it really does feel like something's just being put into my brain, right? So there was one time when my daughter, who is now 16, was a baby. And over the course of 2 days, this story just hit me and came to me, and it came fast and it came full, and I had a full cast of characters, and I was just, scrambling, trying to write notes to keep up with it. So it happens, and it is so exciting when it happens. It fills us with energy. We're just, vitalized and ready to get to work and make this turn into the thing that we want it to be. And they generally grabs hold of us and won't let us go. And it is awesome when that happens. But here's the thing, that is not enough, especially if you feel like this idea was given to you by God. The idea itself is not enough. It's just the first step. And then you have to put the work in. I mean, we know that to a point, right? Obviously, having the idea does not mean words appear on the page, but it even goes deeper than that, because we don't want our final idea to look exactly like the original idea. We think we do sometimes, especially as we're getting started. We think, this was the thing God gave me. This was the inspiration. I need to stay true to it. But Does an apple tree look like an apple seed? Does a strawberry look like a strawberry seed? Does the final plant ever look like the seed? Not so much, right? Just having the seed doesn't do us any good. That's not what we're going for. That's not the final thing. And it's not the purpose. The purpose of the seed, of the inspiration, is to grow and to change in that growing. So the seed is crucial. That initial idea, so important. Obviously, we don't want to downplay that. It is very important, but it's just the kernel. Even if it strikes you like a bolt of lightning, or if it creeps up on you slowly, maybe you go digging for it. However you find it, you have it, there it is. It's an idea for a book, but it is not the book. So I live out in the middle of nowhere and we get seed catalogs. Now, I am not personally a gardener. I'm just going to put that out there. My family owns a farm. My mother-in-law loves gardening, but I like it for a day and then I'm back at my computer writing stories. So I just don't have the time and kind of focus to put into gardening. But I have to admit, I love looking through a seed catalog because there's just such variety there, right? And so something I noticed as I was looking through a seed catalog last year was that even if I go looking for a particular thing, let's say I go looking for strawberries, there are pages of options for strawberry plants. They vary based on, what region they're going to thrive in. They vary based on what flavor you want to end up with. They vary based on color and on size and on firmness and texture. So many things. So even narrowing it down a little bit to, okay, I'm going to look at strawberries, still leaves you with so many options. And, that's kind of the same thing we have when we have an idea for a story or for a nonfiction book or for articles or a screenplay. We have these ideas, but that idea still leaves a world of possibilities. So we have to learn how to ask the questions that are going to help us determine what particular variety of plant we're growing here. So we need to learn how to put our ideas to the test. Otherwise, we can often spend months or even years working on something only to discover down the road, man, that shouldn't have been this. It should have been this thing over here instead. So one of the things that really helps us grow as writers is to learn to ask questions when we first get those ideas to help determine what kind of plant they should really even grow into. So here are some questions that you guys can, jot down to keep in mind for kind of testing your ideas when they come. First of all, has it been done before? Chances are yes, most of our ideas have been done before in some way or another, but has it been done well? The answer is not always yes to that. Has it been done recently? And has it been done in the way that you are thinking you want to do it? So obviously there are tons of books out there on the same subjects. That's fine. But what are you bringing to it that's new? What new focus or new slant or new light are you bringing to it? What new twist are you putting on it? So, what can you do to bring something new to the topic or the genre or whatever it is? And also, you do need to examine, though, because there are times when things have been done so poorly that no one even wants the subject. Like there's almost a taboo on the whole thing. Sometimes it's something like a setting that has been overdone or done very poorly, so people aren't looking for it. So you might have to, even if you're really set on this, prove to them they want it, which is quite a challenge. So know that up front. Don't be shy. Look at it all. Gather your research and figure out, is this thing I'm envisioning even feasible? Is it wanted? Is it going to find a place in the world? So that leads us to our second question. Is there a need for this? Sometimes we have what we think is a great idea, and then we go out and realize no one's looking for it. We think it's awesome, but there's no demand. Or there is a demand, but it's already being met by a lot of other things. So is that worth our efforts if we need to have something new to say? And if we don't have something new to say, maybe we should, look for another idea. So also though, you need to ask, who is the idea for? So this can be a big one. And I hear this from authors all the time, that they want their story to be for everyone. Well, I mean, of course, we all want our story to be for everyone, but it isn't. So we need to know that up front. And we need to know that even if ultimately a very wide audience would enjoy it, it still has to be targeted to a very specific audience. So know who that audience is, focus on them. And then if you do a really good job at it, it will go beyond that target audience. So the next question you're going to want to ask yourself is the idea big enough for what you're planning? Is it big enough to be a book? Is it instead big enough to be a blog post? Maybe it's better suited for an article or even a series of articles. Maybe it's just a novella or a short story. Is it a full feature film if you're writing a screenplay, or is it just a web short? You have to kind of examine your idea and how, not even how full it is, because sometimes something is very complete, it's just smaller, and that's fine. But you have to know that, and that's something that can take some practice too. A lot of times as we get started on projects, we, think it's going to be this big epic thing, and it turns out to only be this big. And that's okay, but it's part of the learning process, knowing how big an idea really is. And knowing that there is a place, especially in this digital world, for all lengths, for all forms. So find the one that best works with your idea, and that your idea will be most impactful and most powerful in. And of course, the final question to ask yourself in your testing questions is, do you love it? We get many ideas in life, and sometimes they feel like, a really powerful idea at first, but sit with it for a while, a few days, a few weeks, and go back to it and think, do I really love this enough to work on it for days or weeks or months or even years sometimes? And if the answer is no, set it aside. I mean, I have had a ton of ideas over the years for nonfiction books. You know how many I've written? None. Because I don't love them enough to write them instead of the fiction I'm working on. Hopefully at some point, that'll change, and I will be able I will have the time to write both, because I would like to explore some of these ideas. But when it comes to prioritizing, I prioritize the projects I love the most. And I always encourage authors to do that too. Trends are going to come and go, and what's selling is going to change. But you have to write what God puts on your heart. So focus on the things you love, and make sure that when you're getting started on a project, it's something you love enough to see through to the end. And if you're not that excited about it, well, then maybe ask yourself, is this what I really need to be working on right now? So answering all these things, all of them at the start of a project, is so vital, because you need to know whether your story is best told in fiction or nonfiction as a start. I mean, maybe it seems self-explanatory to you. I'm a novelist. My stories are best told in fiction. But I know a lot of people who want to talk about a topic or a subject or a hard thing, and they have to ask themselves, would this best be given to readers as nonfiction, as facts, or would they receive it better if it were in a story, if it were, an unfolding flower of truth in fiction? And some choose the fiction route. So it's a question that you need to answer. Maybe your book deals with children, but you need to decide if it's aimed for the kids or if it's aimed at the parents or the grandparents. So this obviously determines how you write it, the vocabulary you use, the length it is. So much is decided by who it is aimed for. And that's going to tell you how to tell the story or give the information that you are feeling called to write. And, going back to the seed analogy, it's the same thing there. Different types of plants require different types of soil. Not everything thrives in the same environment. So you need to think through at the beginning what environment you're aiming for, And that will help you choose the right variety of seed and the right inspiration to develop and the right way to develop that seed of inspiration. All right, so we're going to pause for a moment and take questions while I get a drink of water. Any questions yet?
Nope.
I kill every plant I touch.
I too. I do not have a green thumb at all.
Me neither.
So there's no questions in the chat, but if you have one that has just come up, you can unmute yourself right now and ask it if you'd like to.
Yeah.
Anybody? Nope. Roseanna's doing such a great job covering everything.
That's right. I answer all your questions before you even ask them. All right. So let's say you have your seed, you have your inspiration, you know where you're going to plant it. You have thought through your market and your target audience. So what comes next? Well, next is preparing the soil. So in gardening, I read, I don't do this. Again, I'm not a gardener. This is where you till the ground. So that's where you're removing the stones, you're removing the obstacles, you dig up the soil to mix the layers, and you may add some nutrients, right? So it's the same again for a writer. We have to remove the obstacles. So what stones, what rocks are in the soil of your life that are going to get in the way of turning this inspiration into a thriving plant? What's going to make it more difficult for you to write? So sometimes it's perfectly legitimate things and sometimes it's not legitimate things. So, it could be a full-time job. Obviously, that's going to take time away from when you could be writing, but you probably need to do it. So maybe it's your family. Again, obviously, we need to spend time with our family. They are very important, but do you need to spend 24 hours a day with them? Can you take an hour or two to work on your stuff? Maybe it's fear. Maybe, well, that's one of those not legitimate things that crop up in our life. So how do we root out those rocks of fear? And something I hear a lot, especially from the women among us, is guilt. We feel guilt for taking time from our families or from our other endeavors or from our ministries to spend on this thing that feels selfish, this thing I want to do. Well, here's the thing. While all these are legitimate, most of them, fear, but at any rate, if this is something you feel called to do, if this is something you feel God has put on your heart, or even if it's just something that helps you to grow and thrive as a person, then there needs to be no guilt attached to it. Because I actually view writing as a ministry, and I view my writing time as communion with God, and it gives him honor to live that out. So this is something I touch on in all sorts of my classes, that God did not create us as an empty blank slate. God did not create us just as barren ground, right? We are created with things inside us. He created us to be creative beings. So when we live that out and when we walk that out, we are giving him glory and we are obeying him. There's this quote that I actually found Thanksgiving week this last year that I'm going to horribly maul this, but the kernel of it was, when I am walking out my calling, when I am doing what you call me to do, then I am being obedient. The greatest Thanksgiving I can ever give is to do what you ask me to do. So obedience is Thanksgiving and Thanksgiving is obedience. So that so holds true as writers, that when we are writing, we are glorifying God because we are being who he created us to be. So don't feel bad for that, right? And more, feel bad if you are not giving that its due. So, I mean, if you feel called to the mission field, but then you don't go on missions because it takes too much time from these other things, are you really being obedient? So if you feel called to a writer's life and feel called to write things, but you're not giving it that time, are you being obedient to God? Those are questions you have to ask yourself. And I mean, sometimes we just want to try something and we don't necessarily feel that it's a call from God, and that's fine. It's fine to still explore it as a hobby, and it's also fine to put it aside. But, again, know yourself, know your reasons for doing things, know your why is one of my husband's favorite expressions. And so that's what I really suggest you evaluate is, look at that soil of your life. And if this is something you feel you should be doing, if this is a garden you should be tending, then tend it with care and set yourself up for success. So that means carving out time. That means setting it aside and calling it sacred. It started as a joke. I would say my writing time in the morning is sacred, but it's not a joke. Like this is how I explore my faith. This is how I commune with God, is in my writing. So when my kids were little, they just knew that 5:30 to 7:30 was mommy's time, and they could get up. But if they got up, they could do something quietly on their own. They could play, they could watch TV, but it was not breakfast time yet. And it was not come show mommy everything yet. And it was my time to write. So it was my time to, do my devotional reading and do my blog posts and write my novels. And this was important because that's what helps me, or what allows me to be, walking out the calling I felt on my life. So you have to protect the time and spend the time on it. And, put aside the things that are distracting you from what you feel called to do, whatever you feel called to do, whether it's writing or something else. Don't let the weeds get in the way, right? Don't let the distractions take you away from what you feel you really should be doing. So sometimes in writing, you're going to find that you have a lot of ideas, right? And you work on one for a little while, and then, well, that gets difficult or boring. So you switch over to this other thing and work on that for a while. And in a way, that's fine, especially when you're just writing before contract. It's fine. Jump around, see what works, experiment. But also know that there does come a time where you have to finish things. So as you learn what is a big enough idea to be what you want it to be, and what is a full idea and a finished idea, then you also do need to learn how to stem the distractions and not let them get in the way of finishing what you're working on right now. So let me just tell you, the richest time for new ideas is where I am under deadline on this idea over here. Every time, like, oh man, I really need to focus on project A. You know what sounds great? Project B over here. Man, I want to be doing that. So when these things happen, and they will, grant yourself like an hour to jot down ideas on this other project, because that will come in handy, but go back then to what you need to be working on. So sometimes you're going to find ideas aren't as great as you thought they were. They just aren't workable. And this happens to us all too, especially as we're getting started. I have books in every state of completion, some that are just begun, some that I literally stopped 2 chapters away from the end because I didn't know how I wanted it to end. Things left hanging in the middle because I didn't know where to go with them. And I just left them and never felt the need to go back. So it happens. Plots fizzle out, characters are boring, or you find that this, nonfiction idea, well, you didn't really have as much information as you thought you did, or as much stuff to fill out a whole book. It happens. Not every seed turns into a tree, right? Sometimes they just wither and die in the ground. Sometimes, we'll use Jesus's parable. Sometimes the sun beats down and kills them in a couple days. Sometimes they get snatched away by birds and the cares of the world, or weeds come up and choke it. It happens. And that's okay. Not every idea and every seed and every inspiration need to take root. So know that that's just part of the process. And also, as I mentioned a little bit already, keep in mind that a good gardener, I hear from what I observe in others, doesn't let everything grow. Now, maybe the ones they plant, but are the seeds we plant the only things that crop up in our garden plot? No, those weeds, man, those weeds are a huge thing, and they are going to crop up in your writing life, just like they crop up in your garden. So sometimes you don't even know where they come from. Like, seriously, where did all this stuff in life come from? Or all these projects that I've let myself get distracted by, where did they come from? And sometimes they look really legitimate. Like, I'm going to use as an example, mint. We might grow mint on purpose, but mint spreads. So you might want it over here in its pot, but you don't want it with the tomatoes or whatever. So the same thing can happen with our writing projects, that we need to be focused on just this one thing, but all these other ideas are crowding in. Well, if you leave them there, they're going to steal the nutrients from the thing that you want to be focused on. So you need to weed them out. That doesn't mean you kill them necessarily. I mean, if it's a bad weed, you do. But sometimes it just means transplanting. It means taking it, putting it over here, setting it aside. It means jotting that idea down somewhere else and saving it for later. And that is fine. That's good. That lets you have healthy plants here and then have healthy plants there too. So know that all these shiny new ideas, my best friend, critique partner, and I love to talk about those shiny new ideas. They're great, but they can be just a distraction, and you don't want to let them do that. You want them to have their due, but you want this current project to have its due as well. And then the other thing you have to learn how to do is pruning, editing, right? There are so many times when we think we have something just wonderful and it's great and it's perfect. And then, well, turns out people were asking for edits. They're asking us to change things, cut things, hack things. Man, sometimes by the time you get to an end of a project, I have heard countless authors say it didn't even look like my project anymore. Often I hear this as a complaint. But here's the thing. As I've said already, an apple tree does not look like an apple seed, and it's not supposed to. So this was the biggest thing I had to learn. And honestly, I have said to my husband, who is a publisher, so we talk about this stuff all the time, that in my opinion, after 20 years in this industry, the thing that sets an amateur apart from a professional is their ability to take critique and edits and turn it around to present a final project. So that doesn't mean you do absolutely everything that's suggested. Generally, you can't, because a lot of the suggestions contradict, but it means that you have learned how to take that, apply it to your work, and turn your work into the thing it's supposed to be. It doesn't have to look like what it started as. It has to look like what it should. So, a plant needs to look like the plant it's supposed to be, not like the seed it started out, but not as something else altogether either, right? So learning how to develop that story and go through that process to really turn it into what you want it to be, what it should be, what it feels right being is a hard thing, and it's a learned skill. And I really think that's what separates us at the beginning of our careers from who we grow into as writers. And, that's also the funny thing about inspiration. God gives us what we need to get started, but it's not necessarily what we need to finish. He'll keep giving as we go along the process, if we're open to it, if we're still listening, and if we're willing to put in the work and not just drop a seed in the ground and go and say, it'll take care of itself. God gave it to me. It'll be great. I don't need to do anything else. So the example I love to use here is that story I was telling you about before, that when my daughter was a baby, I got this idea. So at that point in time, the only book I had out was A Stray Drop of Blood. And the idea was for a sequel to A Stray Drop of Blood. And I was going to call it Who Quickens the Dead. And it was brilliant, of course, naturally. And I had the entire idea from start to finish plotted out. I had pages and pages of notes. And I sat down and I tried to write it. And it just wasn't right. No. I knew within a couple pages, nah, that's not it. So I set it aside and kind of, redid it. And there were a couple times over the years where I tried to go back to it and it just wasn't coming. It wasn't working for me. It wasn't right. And I knew I wouldn't be doing it justice if I plowed ahead with this. But every time someone asked a question like, if you could only write one more thing in your life, what would it be? I would say in my heart, it would be that sequel. It would be that sequel. So like every good writer, 7 years later, I finally sat down to evaluate how can I make this story work. So it had been 7 years since I took those notes, and I sat down with it and I realized I was starting in the wrong place and I was trying to follow all the rules, but I was following them in a way that made my story weaker instead of stronger. So instead I was like, you know what? All right. Okay. I have this idea. That's great. In order to get to where the idea wants me to be, I actually need to do it differently than I thought I would. So I started in a different place. I started with her as a child instead of a grown-up, which, why would you start in the backstory? Well, because there was something hard that we needed to experience in her backstory in order to understand where she was in the main part of the story. And it worked. So I still was using that basis of inspiration, but I wasn't afraid to say, you know what? That was the idea that got me started, but this is what I need to actually bring it to fruition. So doing that created the book that I also changed the title of, which is called A Soft Breath of Wind. And God totally gave me the time to write this. I had been under contract. The contract was canceled. So seriously, the same week I prayed, Lord, if you want me to write this, you need to give me the time. Well, contract canceled. Not how I was planning on finding the time to write that, but it worked out really well. And honestly, I went back and reread this book just a year or so ago, and it was like, wow, this is good. I'm still proud of this. So it only became what it needed to be, though, because I wasn't afraid to cut, to change, I threw out a whole POV that I had written, and that's fine. Our job as writers is not just to get inspiration, it's to put in the perspiration. You have to work. You have to recognize when an idea is just a weed and it's a stray and pluck it out. You also have to learn how to prune and edit, and you cut out the things that aren't helpful. And this is what strengthens our work, just as this is what strengthens a plant in a garden. Not every idea fits the thing you're trying to write. And this is another thing that I've just kind of found with all of us as we're getting started. I'm certainly guilty of it too, is we think all our good ideas need to be crammed into one project. And so I have read manuscripts. I have even read some published books, most of them self-published, where it feels like the author's just trying to shove every interesting thing into this one book. And it doesn't work. Because sometimes the idea may be great, but it doesn't belong here. So that's another something we need to learn, is to focus and to take those ideas and put them aside. They're not wasted. You can save them for later, but they don't belong here. So do that, save them. I borrow from my own writing all the time. I always say nothing we write is ever wasted. I am constantly borrowing characters and plot lines from unfinished or unpublished manuscripts. And even the things that I've written that I know I am never going to use. I have whole books that I don't ever intend to publish them. I don't intend to rewrite them. I don't intend to use their characters elsewhere, but they weren't wasted. The writing of them was important for me. I grew as a writer. I learned something about the craft. Honestly, sometimes I write books because of something I'm going through. And so they help me to grow, or I share them with one person and it helps that relationship. So that is perfectly legitimate. Something we need to consider is that sometimes God gives us inspiration for something to write, not because that writing is for others, but because the writing of it is for us. So that also is perfectly legitimate, that he gives us things to help us grow, because we are his plants in his garden, right? And so that is totally fine. I have met I have met several authors over the years who they come to a conference and they're overwhelmed and they just don't know what to do. And I've had to, sit down with them and say, maybe this idea you have is for you. Maybe God gave it to you for you. And there was one time in particular where she just kind of lit up and she was like, really? You think that God would do that he would give something just for me? And it was like this epiphany that he loves me so much. He would give me something to help me grow, not just to help other people grow, which is a kind of funny reverse, right? Like we want to write for other people, and that's wonderful. Obviously, like this is part of the calling. But sometimes we write something that's not intended for anyone else. It's just for us, and that's okay. So we need to figure out though when that is, and figure out what's worth putting the work into to make it for other people, and what should maybe just be set aside and left, and move on to something that's more helpful. And another thing I hear a ton when it comes to editing and pruning is, I was at an author event at a local library, and there was this author sitting beside me who was saying how, well, he had been contracted with his publisher, but the publisher was asking him to change so much it was no longer his book, so he got out of that contract and put it out himself. It was just like, I hear you, because I am a stubborn writer and it took a long time for me to learn how to take critique. But is it a better book than it would have been had you done the things being asked of you? So something, and I talked about this a bit in my keynote, is that writing is not as solitary as we think it is. Being a writer means joining a community of writers, of editors, of agents. And the purpose of all of us together is to create things that matter to people. So we have to trust that people who are editors are following their call. They're doing what God's called them to do. And that is to take your words and make them stronger. So we need to kind of put aside our stubbornness and think, is this going to make us stronger? I mean, when it comes to pruning, I don't honestly know how to do it on plants. I don't know when to cut. I don't know how much to cut. I don't know where to cut, but it is an art and a science, and people know how to do it, right? And when they do it, the plant thrives and it produces big, healthy fruit. Well, we as authors need that. We need somebody who knows how to prune to come in and prune, because it's going to create a stronger work and it's going to produce more fruit. So that means learning how to edit, learning how to cut, learning how to rewrite. And while it may be challenging, it's very important. So much as we would all love to just throw those seeds out there and have them turn into a beautiful garden, it's not the way it works, right? We all have to learn how to tend and how to change and how to make our work the best it can be. We are so lucky to be where we are in history. People have been doing this for a long time. They've been writing fiction. They've been publishing. We get to stand on their shoulders. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. We don't have to learn everything new. We don't have to do it our way, because there's a proven way. So just like, gardeners and farmers today get to rely on the knowledge and the science of those who have come before them, we have that as writers too. We have people that have come before us who have already given us the wisdom. We just have to learn it and absorb it and apply it and not reinvent the wheel. So it's kind of nice, much as my pride wishes that I was just brilliant enough to have this all down from the get-go without needing to learn anything. That is not reality. We all have to learn from others, and we get to learn from others. And it gives us a shortcut. It gives us a boost, instead of having to spend so much time learning everything from the ground up, we can just kind of step up and take in what they've learned and what they've shared and then go from there. And that's how things keep growing and keep developing, whole industries, right? Look at computers. If we had to reinvent every time, we would not be where we are today, but we don't. And that's the same with writers. It's the same with gardeners and farmers. We get to rely on the knowledge already learned and passed down to us. So rely on that, use it, and keep in mind those readers. Always keep in mind the readers. Readers have expectations, and they have those expectations because of all the work that has already come before. We know what we like to read, right? Just like we know what we like to eat. If I'm looking for a strawberry, don't give me a cucumber. If I am looking for broccoli, I don't want corn. So readers have expectations in the same way. If I want to read a romance today, that means I want a happily ever after and I want a romance. I don't want a self-help self-help book. If I'm looking for self-help though, don't give me a romance novel. Readers know what they're looking for. Our job as writers is to give them what they're looking for. The only time it is okay to defy their expectations is when you exceed them. So if you can deliver what they're looking for and then a little bit more, that's okay. If I ask for strawberries and you give it to me with whipped cream, I'm aces. But, make sure you give me the thing I'm looking for first. So that's what we need to do as writers too. Give them what they're looking for and then add a little more. So as I said in my keynote this morning, and I have it in a bunch of other stuff, if you're only writing for you, do what you want. If it's just a hobby, or if it's just for, your kids or your grandkids, write whatever makes them happy and whatever makes you happy. But if you are writing for other people, don't disappoint them. And I hear this a lot from beginning authors too, that I want to write a romance, but I don't want the characters to follow these rules. I don't want to be confined by that. I want to do this thing over here. To which I say, well, then you're not writing a romance, are you? You're not writing a mystery if there's no whodunit. You're not writing a self-help book if you don't give advice. Whatever it is you're working on, you have to deliver the thing people are looking for. So that's kind of what it all comes down to. And I'm going to wrap up here so we have time for questions. Keeping in mind that you may have the best idea in the world, and that is awesome. You want to explore it, but you don't want to be limited by it. You want to use it as the seed and then see what that seed turns into. See what kind of plant is growing, how to make that strong and healthy, how to develop it and let it flourish, how and when to prune so that it creates not only a beautiful plant, but it creates fruit. Because what's the purpose of fruit? That people can come and eat of it, right? It's not just to look pretty. You want them to partake of it. Well, it's the same with our words. We don't just want to create something that we like that looks nice. We want to create something that's going to nourish our readers. So once you figure out how to do that, how to get it to the readers and aren't afraid to change things as necessary to make sure that you're thriving and your plants are thriving and your books are thriving and that they are producing fruit, then you get to send it out into the industry, learn all you can there, figure out where you fit in and what you can bring that is new. So time for questions. Hopefully you guys have some now.
Yes, we have some questions and we have about 8 minutes, okay? So the first question was from Kathy and said, regarding time writing as ministry, she was asking about your schedule and if you write first thing in the morning as your time with God, but she said you pretty much answered that early on when you said, I think 5:30 to 7:30 you set aside.
Yeah.
But do you use that as your quiet time with God, your writing, as your communion?
It depends on the season of life I'm in. I do both. I usually would get up and do some Bible reading and prayer time and then switch to writing. So I was squeezing it all in. And then as I had time throughout the day, I would write at other points too. These days, the morning time has become just my devotional time because my kids are older now. They're not at my elbow all the time. So I've been writing in the later morning and just doing quiet time in them. But it's whatever works for you.
Mm-hmm. So from George, he says, tell us about one of your books and the audience, and then another book with a different audience.
Most of my books are aimed at the same audience. That's how you kind of build your brand, right? You're writing books for the same people, but I do have books that are biblical fiction, and then I have historical romances. And while there is some crossover, they are not the same audience altogether. So they're all for adults. I write for adults. But I have people who read my biblical work who are not interested in my 1910 England work. And I have a lot of people who read my Edwardian English work who have no interest in my biblical work. So different settings give you different audiences, different styles, because my biblicals are not strict romances. So I may occasionally kill a main character in my biblicals. I'm not going to do that in my romances. So there's different expectations of the readers there. And so there's some crossover, but they are not exactly the same.
Okay. So this question is from Reagan. She says, do you have any tips for fleshing out ideas and figuring out a plot that works?
Yeah. We kind of call it, my best friend calls it composting. You just snatch ideas out of the air, like all the ideas you can think of, even if they don't seem to mesh, and write them all down. And then you kind of play a what if game. Well, is there a way to marry this idea to this idea? What if this happened in this way? Playing the what if game is huge. I do this a lot and it's so much fun. Just, how would I get this character to this point? So these aren't things you necessarily use, but they get the ideas flowing. And it's fun to do with a friend too. Stephanie and I have fleshed out whole books in a half-hour conversation doing this. So, just ask those what if questions, or, that random factoid you learned 3 weeks ago. Is there a way to put that in here? Or maybe over there? Or was there something you really enjoyed from this thing you worked on that didn't come to anything? Well, is there a way to put that in here? As long as it makes sense. And then, take some time to write out an outline or a synopsis, a page or two to see if you can turn it into a unified whole. Sometimes you can, sometimes you can't. But just playing with it is so much fun. The brainstorming process is my favorite part because, you do some research, you follow the bunny trails, you see where it leads, and you just kind of jot down everything that's interesting. And while it won't all make it into this book, you never know when that might turn into another one. I do that all the time. I learn something interesting about history and I'm like, this doesn't fit at all here, but I'm totally using it in the next one. So just, write it all down. Don't lose it. Write it all down, make notes, copy links in and, see what works then for the idea that you do want to flesh out right there.
Okay, these next two questions I'm going to combine together because they go along the same lines. It was, one from Joshua. How do you handle cases where your editor makes a suggestion you disagree with? On the one hand, you want to glean from their experience, but on the other hand, you feel it takes away from what you would like. And then Kelly's on top of that is it okay to make the majority of changes an editor suggests, but not make all of their suggested changes?
I mean, absolutely. You never make all of their suggested changes. And they know that. They're just making suggestions. If there's something that they seem pretty insistent on and I'm pretty insistent against, I have a conversation with them and I say, this is why I would like to leave this in here, and then see what they say. Sometimes they will have a very valid reason for why it should not be in there. And sometimes they don't. Sometimes they're like, yeah, that's fine. As long as what it comes down to is addressing the heart of their concern. So it's often not the particular that they're pointing to, it's what that made them feel, or, how this impacts this other later thing. So sometimes there are other ways to address the concern without changing the particular thing that you wanted to have in there. So again, it takes some practice to learn how to do that. But generally you can get to the point where you can go, okay, I understand where you were misunderstanding maybe. So how can I make this clearer? Or, and there are also just times where it's like, no, I really want to leave that scene in. And usually they'll go, okay, it's your book. And then then the consequences are yours. So you have to accept what readers feel. And sometimes you'll be justified. And sometimes people will not like that thing that you insisted on. So, and also you have to consider relationships. If you intend to keep working with these people for a long time, you want to make sure that even if you're not doing it, you're not doing it in a way that doesn't leave them irritated with you.
Okay, we have about 2 minutes and I have 2 questions. From Kelly, do you believe that all romance needs to be formulaic? I, for one, do not enjoy reading formulaic romance because it's too predictable.
It does not need to be formulaic, but it needs to hit the points. Like, you need to have a boy meets girl. There needs to be a hero and a heroine. They need to get together at the end, whether it's, exactly following a formula, no, but it needs to hit the expectations. So I like to think my romances are not formulaic. I toss rules out the window all the time, but I still make sure I'm satisfying the wants that readers come to romance for.
Okay, this question from Lorelei. What if your main project is kind of weighing you down and you just want to take a break from it, write a new idea like a flash fiction piece or a short story? Is that okay? Or do I need to stick to my main project till the end and then take a break and work on something different?
It is totally fine to refresh yourself, especially if you're not under contract. By all means, refresh yourself. Refill, right? You need to refill your wells. So take a break, read, do something you love to do, watch a movie, take a walk, write another project for a while. Yeah, that's fine. Sometimes you just need the break. You need the distance to see what's wrong. Because sometimes we've made a mistake in our manuscript and we don't know what it is because we're too close to it. So we need that break to be able to then come back, and generally once you have some distance, you can go, oh, of course, that's the problem. And then you can fix it. And then you get the energy back. So totally fine to do that.
All right. Well, thank you, Roseanna. Our time is wrapping up here. There are several comments in here. Thank you. Great presentation. Very helpful. Thanks so much. I heard about you from Go Teen Writers and you're awesome.
Thank you.
So lots of thanks in there. I love the seed analogy.
Oh, good. And George asked what my biblical fiction is. A Stray Drop of Blood, A Soft Breath of Wind, Jewel of Persia, and Giver of Wonders are my biblical fiction.
All right. Well, thanks, guys. We got to sign off before Greg comes in and kicks us out. Enjoy
right.
the rest of the conference.
Thank
Thanks,
you,
everyone.
everybody.